Let's go down to the lower C. And then the G. Welcome back to another episode. Now, if you're confused as to why you're seeing this on Sunday instead of Thursday, I actually worked really hard on an episode on Thursday. Some of you were quick enough to catch it. For some reason, the artist that we featured on Thursday just didn't want that video there and managed to report it and get it removed. We didn't use their music, nor did we recreate it. We made it completely in a different key using different instruments and only said good things about the artist. But for whatever reason, they managed to get it taken down. Because I'm dedicated to giving you guys a piece of content each and every week, I reached out on my Instagram story to ask what you guys would like to see. And I got some great answers surrounding sampling techniques. So apologies that this video is a little bit rough around the edges. I wanted to edit it as minimally as possible to get it out as quickly as possible for you guys. Just so you know, if you're a member or not, over at the Patreon, there is a very similar episode to what you might have missed on Thursday. That's for any kind of member. You don't even have to join the Patreon if you just want to watch it. I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's dive into it. Okay, so let's dive into some of the methods that we can sample an entire track or a layered sample. You're going to want something like electric, so you can figure out the key of that sample. What I'm going to do is just grab this layered sample by the count. This is going to be in place of our full song. One of my clients wanted to create sort of beyond a chopped and screwed version of a track that they liked by Drake and create this like ethereal ambient vibe. So I was showing them a few ways in which we can get a more unique sound. The first off is going to be with Simpler. What we're going to do is take this sample and drop it into a new MIDI track that creates a simpler instrument. From here, we can of course check the key of the song. So at the end of this sample, we get this sound. I'm actually going to pitch this a few semitones up, just so that we're not in its original key. I don't want to get demonetized twice in a row. So I want to get as close to this chord as I can. Sounds like there's a lot of great material in here, and I'm going to press Command J. That consolidates that file, and I can drop it into Simpler. Now I have more of a truncated sample than I had originally. And what I want to do is find the note that is playing within this sample. So it sounds like F. So what I can do in Simpler is pitch this down to C from F. So that's going to be 5 semitones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 semitones down. And that means that that note that plays with the chord at C is also going to be middle C on the keyboard as well. I can get rid of this sample. So there's a few things that we can do with this sample when it's inside Simpler. The first thing that I'm going to do is take up the attack a little bit so it doesn't feel as clicky. And then I'm going to increase the release as well. So when I take my finger off the key, we still get a little tail from that sample. If I increase it quite a lot, we of course get much more of that sample. When you're working with a layered sample or something that sounds like a chord, I wouldn't actually play chords on the MIDI keyboard. You'll get something like this. Ugh, it sounds horrible. But you can play single notes to create different chord patterns. Melodic house chords work really great. What we can also do is click Warp, come to Controls, and mess with the LFO a little bit. If I increase the pitch, we can get something that kind of bends and winds a little bit more. Let's set that to a 16th note grid and listen to the pitch now. So we get something that sounds a little bit more analog, a little bit older, so the pitch is warping. If we take that pitch down and increase the filter to 24 and bring that filter down to about 1K, we get something like this. So there's many ways that we can extrapolate that original sample from what it initially sounded like. I don't tend to use Simpler that often because I want more control. So I'm going to undo those settings. right click the top banner of the simpler instrument and come to sampler. From here we can create a little bit more of a sustain mode. What's that? Well, when we create a loop at the top with this bar here, we'll start our sample from this position, but it will loop over in this position. Now what I want to try to create as best I can is a loop that sounds unending. You could hear a little bit of pitch difference there. So I'm going to pull this sample back. I'm going to make sure that snap is on. Snap means that we're always at the 0 crossing mark here. So you can see where this waveform crosses that gray region there, and the same at the end of this sample, we're crossing that same gray region just here. This is going to help reduce the likelihood of any pops or clicks. Not all the time, but it does definitely help. So now let's see where our sample is at. This is pretty good. I'm just going to pull this to a slightly smaller region. I'm going to make sure that I get the bracket between these two bulbous regions of the waveform so that it sounds like the chord is just sustaining on and on and on. That sounds good, but there's a tiny little click there. So what I'm going to do is increase the crossfade. You'll notice that it fades out at this point and fades in at this point. That should help me get more of a constant. I'm pretty happy with that. So what can I do to make this sound a little bit more exciting? Well, I'm going to do the same as before, come over to our filter, and I'm just going to increase that attack a little bit more. It keeps the settings of the simpler instrument, so my release is still at 1 second, my attack was at 20. I'm just going to make sure to increase it so it feels a little bit more like a pad. And from here, I'm going to add the grain delay. With the grain delay, you can get some really cool like pitch kind of bubbles, if you like. You want to increase the spray, decrease the frequency, increase the pitch to 12, and increase the feedback to just under 50%, the dry wet to about 50% as well. And if you want to, you can increase that sync. So now you have something like this. And what's really cool is you can duplicate that, maybe change that delay ever so slightly, maybe change the feedback as well, and then pitch this -12 down. So now we have this really lovely thick chord. If you've seen my burial video or creating pads from white noise, you'll know that you can go down to the modulation of the sampler and get really experimental there too. I'll leave that video linked in the top right. Another way that I like to get creative with layered samples, we're going to come to one-shot samples for melodies as well. So if you know all of this, feel free to use the timestamps to find that later in the video. But right now I want to use the Granulator 3 to show you how I make these samples even more weird and wonderful. We're going to take that sample just like we did before and drag it into the Granulator 3. I just consolidated that last part of the sample. I'm going to drag it into the Granulator, and from here I like to work backwards. Now we move through this sample with position, but we can also scan the sample as well. If I hold down C, we're just going to loop over this section, which sounds really nice. We don't get any pops or clicks like we did with the sampler. If we increase the scan, it will actually scan through the sample, and increasing that will mean it will scan through more of the sample or less of the sample. I'm going to keep that kind of low. The grain size is obviously how much of that sample do you want to loop. As I said, what I like to do is move backwards through this sample. We start at the furthest right position, hold the key that we want, and move backwards and then forwards through the sample. This is a great technique to resample on a new track, which we'll dive into in just a sec. So Will, why would we want to do that? Well, if we add a long tail reverb, I'm going to use Valhalla, and we combine that with a delay perhaps. Maybe we filter that delay a little bit. Now we can do something like this. So we get some really interesting sounds. As before, I'm going to increase that attack so it becomes more pad-like, and increase that release just a little bit as well. We're going to create a new track, resample, and then record on both of these tracks together. I'm going to play a C, the lower C, and then the higher G. Let's go down to the lower C. the G. How gorgeous is that? So now we have some chords to work with. If we were utilizing a full song or a section of a full song, we would hear these little echoes of something that sounded familiar in a real like pad-like format. There's one more way that I like to use the granulator, and that is to take the sample, hit R to reverse that sample, consolidate it, and then drag it to the granulator once again. We can maybe get rid of the delay. And now what we can do is automate sections of that song, and they'll all play in reverse. Let me show you what I mean. What we're going to do is hold down one MIDI clip at C. And then making sure that we click position and then our A key, we're going to bring up automation and we're going to find a starting point. That sounds good. We're going to move to a new section for our second chord. Let's do this on the next bar. You continue to automate in that fashion until you feel like you've come up with a unique loop, and then you can resample that to a new track. Here's one that I prepared earlier for you guys. This is pitched down an octave in the warp modes. And if we add a ducker, we can do this with the sidechain. I'm going to do it with Kickstart 2. We get something that feels a little bit more rhythmic. We can add an LFO that will be tied to the frequency of an auto filter. So we just grab this and click frequency, and then just set the rate to half. Now we've got some filter automation, and then we can create some analog vibrato with the wobble effect here. That's so far from the original sample that we were just looking at with the count. But what if we wanted to put a melody on top of this? Then what I would do is find a singular one-shot sample, something like this KV bamboo flute. We've got this sound. This is the perfect thing to use for the sampler instrument. So a new MIDI track, we drop that sample in. We're going to right click it and then choose sampler. From here, I probably don't want that pitch sweep at the beginning. So we're just going to chop that off. And then we're also going to set the root note to E so that it's in the right key when we perform it on the keyboard. Don't forget, we can also set that sustain mode. The sample's probably long enough that we don't need to loop it, but just for the purposes of staying on track with this tutorial, that's what we'll do. And then similar to what we've done before, I'm going to add a little bit of vibrato. So it's just got a little bit of movement now. I'm going to add the auto filter again so that there's a little bit of movement. So we need that LFO, and we're going to tie this to the frequency. We're just going to set a very slow rate. We're going to set that offset all the way right so that it pretty much stays up that end of things. Might just increase that speed a little bit, and then take that depth down so it doesn't move quite as much. I think we need some reverb. And then from here, we can set our fade in amount as we did before. A little bit of release. And then we can play that with our above instrument. I'm going to do one piece more of automation after this, just to make it a little bit more exciting. I'm going to add just a little bit more EQ. There we go. From here, what we can do to make it sound a little bit more unique in places is mess with this auto pan. I'm going to take the amount, rate, and phase all the way up, and then I'm going to automate the amount in at this point, take it out in some places, and back in at other places. The rate we can mess with. And now we get something that sounds a little bit different the second time around. So there are some of my favorite ways to utilize the different sampling options inside Ableton. I go into a much deeper dive on sampling in the video that's linked in the top right of this video or in the description as well. I'd love to shout out DistroKid for sponsoring this video. I use DistroKid for all of my musical releases, and one thing that is helping me connect with other producers in the community is their playlister function. It's way too easy for our music to be removed on botted playlists these days, but with Playlister, you're able to find the email or the Instagram or whatever way that these curators of playlists like to receive submissions. It helps you generate a real lasting relationship and get on some of the biggest playlists within your niche. The Lo-Fi Focus is of course featured there as well. If you want to get a 7% discount off your first year, then just use the link in the description. I think students get a 50% discount as well. Check out the link for more information. Thank you as always for swinging by, and I'll see you next time.